Sophie Roberts was a 25-year-old interior designer living in New York City. She wasn't born into wealth, and she had never once dreamed of living a life of luxury. Her days were spent working at a small but reputable design firm, where she crafted beautiful, functional spaces for clients who were mostly middle-class professionals. Sophie loved her job, designing homes, helping people create spaces that felt like their own, but her dream went beyond that. She dreamed of creating her own design company one day, building a name for herself, and offering affordable, sustainable designs to the world. Sophie's life was simple. She lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, a far cry from the glamorous world of Manhattan's wealthy elite. She had a small group of close friends, a family she adored, and a passion for design that kept her moving forward every day. She was content with what she had until one fateful evening that would change her life forever. Maxwell Thornton was a name that commanded attention. At 33, he was the CEO of Thornton Group, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that operated in the luxury goods and real estate industries. He was the epitome of success, sharp, decisive, and always in control. Maxwell didn't trust easily. He had spent his life building his empire, brick by brick, trusting no one but himself. His cold, calculating demeanor was his shield, and his wealth was his weapon. Maxwell had a reputation as a business genius, but his personal life was something he kept under tight control. He had no time for relationships. His company was his priority, and his love life was non-existent. The women he met were often more interested in his bank account than in him, so he stopped bothering with them altogether. Despite his success, Maxwell felt a growing emptiness that he couldn't shake. It wasn't that he didn't have everything he could ever want, he had it all. But deep down, he knew something was missing. The night everything changed began like any other night for Maxwell Thorntonate. Yet another high-profile charity gala in Manhattan. He'd been invited by a business partner to this particular event, an exclusive gathering of the city's elite, and while Maxwell was used to these types of events, he never felt at home in them. It was all about appearances, power plays, and networking. But he had no choice but to show up. Business was business. Sophie, on the other hand, had no intention of being at this gala. She was merely there to help set up the event for her company, as they had been hired to design the decor for the evening. Sophie had never imagined herself in such an extravagant environment, but she was excited nonetheless. She was an artist at heart, and tonight was an opportunity to showcase her work to a new crowd. The event was glamorous, beautifully dressed people mingling, sipping champagne and exchanging business cards. Sophie couldn't help but feel a little out of place in her simple black dress, but she pushed aside her discomfort. She was there for a reason, to help design the event and make sure everything ran smoothly. It was when the lights flickered and a minor accident occurred with one of the displays that Sophie's life took a sudden turn. A massive floral arrangement, designed by the event's florist, toppled over, narrowly missing a few guests. In the chaos, Sophie found herself stepping in to help the calm presence amid the confusion. She quickly organized the staff to fix the situation, her hands steady despite the rising panic around her. It was then that Maxwell noticed her. He stood by, observing the scene with interest. Most people in this high society world would have avoided getting involved, but not Sophie. She handled the situation effortlessly, taking charge and ensuring the problem was solved with grace. Maxwell found himself impressed. Most of the women he encountered in these events were all style and no substance, concerned more with their appearance than anything else. But Sophie was different. Later that evening, as the event resumed, Maxwell made his way toward Sophie. He had been intrigued by her calmness under pressure, and for the first time in a while, he found himself wanting to know more about her. "Impressive work back there," Maxwell said, his voice smooth, yet carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. He extended his hand toward her. "Maxwell Thornton." Sophie hesitated for just a second before taking his hand. She had heard of Maxwell. He was a name that everyone in the business world knew. But she wasn't about to be. She smiled politely. "Sophie Roberts. I'm just doing my job." Maxwell's smile grew, a slight spark of amusement in his eyes. "Well, you do it very well. I'm curious, how did you manage to stay so composed? Most people would have panicked in that situation." Sophie shrugged, feeling a little awkward now that they were standing face to face. "I guess it's just part of the job. When you're in design, things don't always go according to plan. You have to be prepared for the unexpected." Maxwell nodded, impressed by her response. He wasn't used to women being so grounded, so unaffected by his reputation. "I admire that. You're very different from the others." Sophie didn't know how to respond to that. Was he complimenting her, or was it just a passing comment? She'd met enough wealthy men in her line of work, and most were more interested in showing off their status than in anything real. "I'm just here to make sure everything goes smoothly," she said, taking a step back. "I'm sure you have plenty of people to talk to tonight." Maxwell's eyes softened for a moment, and he gave a small chuckle. "You'd be surprised. Most people only want something from me. It's refreshing to meet someone who isn't trying to sell me something." Sophie smiled, feeling a warmth in his words. It was rare for someone like Maxwell to be so candid, and even rarer for him to show any vulnerability. She was intrigued, but she wasn't going to get too invested. After all, their worlds were vastly different, and she had her own ambitions to focus on. "Well, I'd better get back to work," she said, starting to turn away. Maxwell, however, wasn't ready to let her go just yet. "Before you go, would you consider joining me for a drink? I promise I won't try to sell you anything," he said with a half-dash smile. Sophie paused, debating for a moment. It wasn't every day that she was offered a drink by someone as successful as Maxwell Thornton, but she didn't want to get caught up in a world she didn't belong to. "All right. Just one drink," she agreed, turning back to face him. The evening after the charity gala, Sophie couldn't help but replay her brief conversation with Maxwell Thornton in her mind. It was unlike any interaction she had ever had. Maxwell was everything she expected from a man of his wealth and power, charming, confident, and composed. But there was something different about him, something that caught her off guard. He had shown a side of himself that most people didn't get to see. Sophie had always kept a safe distance from men like him, men with too much power and too many secrets, but Maxwell was undeniably intriguing. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter as she was making dinner. It was a message from an unknown number, Maxwell Thornton. "Sophie, I enjoyed our brief chat last night. I was hoping we could continue the conversation over dinner. Would you join me at the Regency tomorrow evening at 7? It would be a pleasure to get to know you better." Sophie stared at the message for a moment, her heart racing. She hadn't expected an invitation so soon, and especially not to such an upscale restaurant. She wasn't one to get swept up in the whirlwind of high society, but there was something about Maxwell's calm confidence that made her feel comfortable. "Sophie, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the invitation. See you tomorrow." She quickly sent the message, trying to brush off the sudden fluttering in her chest. She couldn't deny it. She was curious. Maxwell Thornton, the billionaire CEO, was a mystery, and Sophie wanted to know more. The next evening, Sophie found herself standing outside the Regency, one of the most prestigious restaurants in Manhattan. The polished marble floors, the glow of crystal chandeliers, and the sleek decor inside felt worlds away from the life she had known. But as she walked inside, a familiar feeling of unease settled in. She had never been one for the extravagant life that men like Maxwell represented. But tonight, she was here on his invitation, and she was determined to make the most of it. She was greeted by a Marta D, who led her to a private table by the window. Maxwell was already there, sitting with his back straight, his black suit perfectly tailored to his tall frame. He looked every bit the part of the powerful businessman that he was. When he saw Sophie, his lips curved into a smile that was equal parts warmth and intrigue. "Good evening, Sophie," he said, standing to greet her. "I'm glad you could make it. Please, sit. I'm excited to continue our conversation." Sophie smiled, trying to shake off her nerves. "Thank you for inviting me, Maxwell. It's a bit overwhelming," she admitted, gesturing to the lavish "but I'm glad to be here." Maxwell's gaze softened. "Don't worry, Sophie. I promise you, the food is the only thing that should be overwhelming tonight." They sat down, and the waiter poured wine into their glasses. Sophie couldn't help but feel a little out of place, but Maxwell's easy manner put her at ease. They talked about business at first, his company's recent successes, the challenges they were facing in a competitive market, but as the evening went on, their conversation shifted. It became more personal, more genuine, as they sipped their wine. Sophie found herself talking about her childhood, her dreams, and her aspirations. She mentioned her father, how she had never known much about his past, and how he had always kept a distance between himself and the world. Sophie's family was humble, and although they weren't wealthy, her father had made sure she had everything she needed. "I've always been curious about my family's history," Sophie said, pausing to take a sip of her wine. "My father never talked much about his life before he met my mother. It was almost like there was something he was hiding. It wasn't until he passed away that I realized just how little I knew about him. I found a few things in his study, but I never thought much of it until recently." Maxwell listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. "What do you mean?" he asked, intrigued. Sophie shifted in her seat, unsure whether she should reveal more. But something in Maxwell's gaze, something in the way he was listening so carefully, encouraged her to keep going. "I found a letter hidden among some old papers. It was from a law firm. It mentioned my inheritance, something about a trust fund set up for me, but there was nothing else." "It was as if my father had never spoken of it," Sophie said, her voice tinged with confusion. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "Inheriting something. Do you know what it was about?" Sophie shook her head. "I have no idea, but now that I think about it, it's been on my mind a lot. It doesn't make sense. I don't come from money. My mother was a school teacher, and my father, well, he kept things very private." Maxwell sat back in his chair, processing her words carefully. He knew something Sophie didn't. He had already looked into her family's history after their first encounter, and what he had discovered was shocking. Maxwell hadn't expected to hear this. He had already uncovered a piece of the puzzle. Sophie Roberts was the heir to an incredible fortune. Her father, Victor Roberts, had been the founder of Roberts Enterprises, a massive corporation in the luxury goods sector. The company's value had soared over the years, and now Sophie was the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. Maxwell had been watching Sophie closely since their first meeting. His initial interest in her had been genuine, but now, knowing who she truly was, things had changed. He wasn't sure how to handle the information. Should he tell her the truth now, or let her find out on her own? He decided to keep quiet for now. But he knew one thing for sure. Sophie's life was about to change forever. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned more light-hearted. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Maxwell wasn't telling her. His interest in her had grown more intense, but it wasn't just about her passion for design or her intelligence. There was something deeper, something more complex, that she hadn't yet figured out. Maxwell, on the other hand, couldn't ignore the fact that Sophie, the woman he had grown to care for, was unaware of her true identity. He wanted to tell her, to help her understand the legacy her father had left for her. But at the same time, he knew he had to tread carefully. Sophie had lived her entire life without the burden of her family's wealth, and he didn't want to thrust that reality on her to suddenly dot as they parted ways that evening. Maxwell couldn't help but feel conflicted. He had crossed a line by getting involved in Sophie's life, and now it seemed that everything was changing. The next few days were a whirlwind for Sophie Roberts. After the dinner with Maxwell, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange conversation they had. The idea that her father, Victor Roberts, might have left her an inheritance had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She had spent her life thinking she came from modest means. Her mother was a teacher, her father an enigmatic man who rarely spoke of his past. The letter she had found, buried in an old box of papers, was the first hint that there was more to her family's history than she had ever imagined. Determined to uncover the truth, Sophie decided to visit the law firm that had sent her the letter. The office was in a sleek, modern building in the heart of Manhattan, far from the neighborhood where Sophie had grown up. The receptionist directed her to a small office on the top floor, where she was greeted by Julian Carter, a well-dressed lawyer in his 40s. "Ms. Roberts." "Thank you for coming in," Julian said, offering her a seat. "I know this may be overwhelming, but I'm here to help you understand your father's estate." Sophie nodded, her palms slightly sweaty. "I don't understand. I had no idea my father had this kind of wealth. Why didn't he ever tell me?" Julian opened a large folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. Victor Roberts was a private man. "Ms. Roberts, he wanted to ensure that his legacy would be protected until the right time came for you to take control. This inheritance and the family assets were kept from you until you turned 25, your father's wish." Sophie's mind was racing. Victor Roberts, man she had always known as an elusive figure, was the founder of one of the largest luxury goods conglomerates in the world, with billions in assets. She had no idea. "Are you saying I'm the heir to his empire?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Julian nodded. "Yes, the Roberts Enterprises, the luxury goods division, and other holdings. It's all yours now, Miss Roberts. You are the sole heir." The gravity of the situation hit Sophie like a wave. She hadn't signed up for this. She wasn't ready for this kind of responsibility. She was a designer, not a business mogul. Sophie had no idea what to do with such a vast fortune, but the truth was undeniable now. She couldn't escape it. Meanwhile, Maxwell Thornton was becoming more consumed with thoughts of Sophie. Ever since their conversation at the gala, he had been unable to shake the feeling that Sophie was not just any ordinary woman. She was tied to something much bigger than both of them. He had done his own research on Victor Roberts and his company, and he knew the significance of Sophie's inheritance. Maxwell had always kept his distance from matters of inheritance. He didn't want to get tangled up in family legacies or power struggles. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Sophie's life was about to change forever. He couldn't help but feel that his growing feelings for her were complicated. By the knowledge he had about her wealth, he was also beginning to feel responsible for Sophie. He had been the one to get involved in her life, to help her navigate through the maze of her father's inheritance. And now, with Hugo, his old friend and business partner, starting to get involved in the situation, Maxwell knew things were about to get even more complicated. Hugo was Maxwell's oldest friend. They had known each other since childhood and had partnered together in several ventures over the years. On the surface, Hugo was charming, calculated, and always playing the part of a loyal confidant. But beneath that, Maxwell knew Hugo had ambitions of his own. After Maxwell had privately confirmed that Sophie was the sole heir to her father's fortune, he hadn't said anything to her yet. But Hugo had caught wind of the news and immediately began scheming. Hugo was used to controlling assets, and Sophie's inheritance represented a golden opportunity. He didn't have the same genuine affection for Sophie that Maxwell did. To Hugo, Sophie was just another pawn in his game. Maxwell was aware of Hugo's calculating nature, but he hadn't anticipated how far Hugo would go to get what he wanted. He was worried about the influence Hugo could have over Sophie, especially when she was so vulnerable and uncertain about her newfound wealth. Maxwell had always respected Hugo's business acumen, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that his friend was about to make a move that would jeopardize everything. Over the next few days, Sophie was consumed with conflicting emotions. She felt like her life had been flipped upside down. One minute, she was just a simple designer trying to make her way in the world, and the next, she was faced with the responsibility of running a global empire. She was overwhelmed with the logistics of managing her father's estate, and the weight of her new role as heir to Robert's enterprises was suffocating. Sophie had always valued independence, but now she found herself caught in a world of power, money, and influence that she didn't know how to navigate. She had started to meet with some of the top executives of Robert's enterprises, including her father's old colleagues, who were eager to welcome her into the fold. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that these people didn't see her as a person only, as a way to access the fortune she had inherited. They spoke to her with a kind of forced politeness that made her uncomfortable. Her only solace was her growing connection with Maxwell. After learning about her inheritance, he had been understanding and patient, offering guidance without pushing her too hard. Sophie found herself leaning on him more than she expected, but as much as she trusted him, she still couldn't help but wonder if there was something Maxwell wasn't telling her. His quiet intensity, his concern for her well-being, it all seemed too perfect. Was he really helping her out of kindness, or was there something more to his interest in her? The day Sophie met with Maxwell to discuss the estate, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her chest. She had made up her mind. She was going to confront him about his true intentions. Sophie needed answers, and she wasn't going to let her growing feelings for him cloud her judgment. Sophie arrived at Maxwell's office, her heart pounding. She could feel the tension in the air as she stepped into his sleek, modern space. Maxwell was sitting behind his desk, reviewing some documents when she walked in. "Maxwell," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "we need to talk. About everything." Maxwell looked up, his expression serious. "I know. We've both been avoiding the inevitable, Sophie took a deep breath. I know about the company, Maxwell. I know what I've inherited. But I still don't understand why you're helping me. You've been so kind, but there's something more here, isn't there? You've got your own agenda, don't you? Maxwell stood up, walking round the desk. Sophie, I'm not trying to manipulate you. I don't want anything from you except for you to be able to navigate this new world you've found yourself in. I care about you, and that's the truth. But Sophie wasn't convinced. Then why do I feel like I'm just another asset to you? Why does it feel like you're only helping me because of the money? Maxwell's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Sophie saw a vulnerability in him. I'm not perfect, Sophie, but I swear to you, I've never cared about money as much as I care about you. This isn't just about business or inheritance, it's about us. Hugo Calloway was a man used to getting what he wanted. He was smart, ambitious, and always had a knack for finding opportunities, sometimes in places where others would see none. He had been a close friend and business partner of Maxwell Thornton for over a decade. Their partnership had been built on shared ambitions, mutual respect, and a certain level of trust. But recently, Hugo had begun to notice something that made him uneasy. Sophie Roberts. When Hugo first heard that Sophie was the sole heir to Victor Roberts' massive fortune, he hadn't immediately realized the significance. It was only after he did some digging that he realized the potential of what was at stake. The inheritance was huge, not just in financial terms, but in terms of power, influence, and opportunity. Sophie's inheritance could change the course of Maxwell's business. Hugo's mind began to churn with possibilities. He had always admired Maxwell, but recently he had begun to resent how much of the limelight Maxwell had taken. Hugo had always felt like he was in the shadows, working behind the scenes, making all the right moves to support Maxwell's success. But now it felt like he was being left behind. If he could control Sophie's inheritance, he could control Robert's enterprises, and that meant he could control the future both of the company and his own. Destiny. Maxwell had always trusted Hugo. They had been through thick and thin together, building Thornton Group from the ground up. Hugo had been by his side through the hardest business decisions, always providing the support Maxwell needed. But recently, Maxwell had started to notice changes in Hugo's behavior. There were small things: Hugo's increasing interest in Sophie's inheritance, the subtle way he had been pushing for more influence in their business dealings, and the fact that he had started questioning Maxwell's decisions. But Maxwell, ever the diplomat, had brushed it off as nothing. He didn't want to believe that his oldest friend would turn on him, especially over something as trivial as business. But now, with Sophie's inheritance hanging in the balance, Maxwell couldn't ignore his growing doubts. Hugo's recent behavior was beginning to seem more than just friendly concern. It felt like an agenda, and that made Maxwell uneasy. The more time Sophie spent in the world of business, the more she realized how complex everything was. She had always lived a simple life, finding joy in designing homes and creating functional spaces. But now, she was thrust into a world of power, wealth, and people who saw her as a pawn in a much larger game. Sophie knew that her father had kept a distance from her, and it was becoming clearer why. She had always suspected that there was something more to his life, something he hadn't shared with her. Now she had inherited it all: the business, the wealth, the power, and she was expected to manage it all. But Sophie didn't feel ready. She had no experience in running a global empire, and the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Her trust in Maxwell had grown over the past few weeks. He was the only person who seemed to genuinely care for her, offering guidance and support without expecting anything in return. But there was still something she couldn't shake off, the nagging feeling that Maxwell wasn't telling her everything. She had noticed the tension between him and Hugo. And although Maxwell had brushed it off as nothing, Sophie could see that something wasn't right. Hugo's influence seemed to be growing, and Sophie began to wonder if his interest in her inheritance was more than just a business matter. It was late one evening when Sophie decided she could no longer ignore the growing suspicion in her heart. She needed answers, and she needed to hear them from Maxwell. She called him to meet at his office, knowing that this conversation could change everything. Maxwell was seated at his desk when she entered, his expression unreadable. He had been working late, as always, but there was something different in the air tonight. Sophie took a deep breath and sat down across from him. "We need to talk, Maxwell," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "About Hugo, about what's really going on." Maxwell raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained calm. "Sophie, you know I've always been open with you. What's this about?" Sophie hesitated, but only for a moment. "I've noticed the way Hugo's been acting lately. It's like he's after something. He's been too interested in my inheritance. And I know it's not just about business." Maxwell stood up, pacing in front of her. "Sophie, I've known Hugo for years. I trust him, but I understand your concerns. You're right to be cautious, but you also need to understand that this inheritance, this company, it's not just money, it's power, and people will do anything to get it." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "And Hugo, you think he's just looking out for me?" Maxwell stopped pacing and turned to face her. "No, I don't. I think he sees an opportunity, and he won't hesitate to take it if he thinks it'll benefit him. But you don't need to worry about him. I won't let him hurt you." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't know who to trust anymore, Maxwell. I've always been independent, but now everything's changing. I don't know how to handle this." Maxwell walked toward her and knelt down in front of her. "Sophie, I'm here for you. I'll help you with everything. But you need to understand one thing. You're not alone in this. We're in this together." Sophie looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she felt a sense of relief. He wasn't like the others. He didn't want to control her or manipulate her. He genuinely cared for her, but the weight of the situation was heavy, and Sophie knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. Later that evening, as Sophie returned to her apartment, she couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. She had opened up to Maxwell, but the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. Was Hugo really after her wealth? Or was there something else at play, something even more dangerous than she had anticipated? The next day, Sophie received an unexpected visitor, Hugo. He had come to discuss business, but Sophie knew there was more to his visit. He was too eager, too calculated in his approach. "You know, Sophie," Hugo began, his voice smooth and persuasive, "you have something very valuable now, and I just want to make sure you're making the right choices. You don't want to make any mistakes." Sophie crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "What exactly do you mean, Hugo?" Hugo smiled, but it was cold. "Don't worry, I'm just looking out for you. After all, we all want the same thing, don't we? Success, power, security." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't trust him. She never would. The days following her meeting with Hugo left Sophie feeling unsettled. She couldn't shake the cold, calculated smile he had given her, nor the way he had subtly suggested that she needed his guidance to manage her newfound wealth. She had always been independent, fiercely so, and the idea that someone, especially Hugo, could manipulate her into giving up control of her inheritance made her stomach churn. Maxwell had promised to protect her, to help her navigate this new world. But the more time she spent thinking about it, the more Sophie realized how out of her depth she truly was. She didn't know the first thing about managing a multi-billion-dollar empire, and the pressure of it all weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had always been content with her simple life, designing homes, creating beautiful spaces for others, but now everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. Every move she made seemed to be under the microscope, and Hugo's subtle threats only added to the weight on her chest. Sophie paced around her small apartment, her mind racing. She had trusted Maxwell, but now she wasn't so sure. His assurances that he would protect her seemed less convincing every day, and his growing closeness to her felt complicated. She didn't want to believe that Maxwell had an ulterior motive, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no idea what Maxwell's true intentions were. Meanwhile, Maxwell was dealing with his own internal battle. He had been working tirelessly to protect Sophie from the chaos surrounding her inheritance, but Hugo's manipulations were starting to reach a boiling point. Hugo's moves were becoming bolder, more aggressive, and Maxwell was beginning to feel cornered. For the first time, Maxwell felt completely out of control. His business, his life, everything he had built, it all seemed to be teetering on the edge of disaster. And in the midst of it all, Sophie was in danger. He couldn't let that happen. Maxwell had always been a man of action, decisive and ruthless when it came to business. But when it came to Sophie, his emotions were clouding his judgment. He couldn't deny that he had feelings for her, strong ones, but he didn't know how to navigate the complexities of their relationship. Was he helping her because he cared about her, or was he merely trying to protect his own interests? One evening, as Maxwell was heading back to his office after a long day of meetings, he was confronted by Hugo in the lobby of his building. The tension between the two men had been building for weeks, but now it was palpable. "Hugo," Maxwell said, his voice cold and controlled. "What do you want?" Hugo's smirk never faltered. "I'm just here to make sure we're all on the same page, Maxwell. You know, I've been thinking a lot about Sophie's inheritance. It's a shame she's so clueless about how to handle it. It'd be a shame if someone took advantage of her navette." Maxwell's jaw clenched. "I don't need your help with Sophie. Stay out of it, Hugo." Hugo laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you and Sophie anymore. This is about the future of Robert's enterprise, is about all of us. And if Sophie doesn't step up, well, I'm sure someone will be happy to take the reins." Maxwell's eyes narrowed, the anger building inside him. "You're not getting anywhere near her. Hugo, don't think for a second that I'll let you manipulate her." Hugo's expression darkened, and for the first time, Maxwell saw the real danger in his eyes. "You should have stayed out of this, Maxwell. Now you've made it personal. Don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Hugo turned and walked away, leaving Maxwell standing there, fuming with a mix of anger and dread. He knew Hugo wasn't bluffing. Hugo had never been one to back down, and now that he knew about Sophie's inheritance, things were about to get ugly. Later that evening, Sophie found herself standing outside Maxwell's office, hesitating. She had spent hours thinking about everything about the inheritance, about Hugo, and most of all, about Maxwell. There was no denying that she cared for him, but the growing tension between them, the uncertainty about his motives, it was all too much. She had to know the truth. And she had to do it alone. Taking a deep breath, Sophie pushed open the door to Maxwell's office and stepped inside. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing some documents, but he looked up immediately when he saw her. The look on his face softened, and for a moment, Sophie felt a pang of guilt for doubting him. "Sophie," Maxwell said, standing up to greet her. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. What's going on?" Sophie didn't waste any time. "Maxwell, we need to talk. About Hugo, about everything." Maxwell's eyes darkened, and he motioned for her to sit down. "What's on your mind?" Sophie took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about everything lately, about the inheritance, about Hugo, about us, and I need to know the truth. Are you helping me because you care about me, or is there something else? I can't keep going back and forth, not knowing where I stand." Maxwell sat down across from her, his expression serious. "Sophie, I care about you, more than I ever expected to. I know I've been distant at times, and I've been trying to protect you from everything that's happening with your inheritance. But the truth is, I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. You're not alone." Sophie's heart fluttered at his words, but doubt still lingered in her mind. "But what about Hugo? What about all the things he's been saying?" Maxwell's jaw clenched. "Hugo is playing a dangerous game. He's trying to manipulate you, Sophie. He sees you as a way to expand his influence, and I won't let him use you. But the truth is, I'm not sure how far he'll go to get what he wants." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't want to be a pawn in anyone's game, but I don't know how to stop him. I don't know how to protect myself." Maxwell reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, for the first time." Sophie allowed herself to believe that she could trust him. There was something genuine in Maxwell's eyes, something that made her feel safe, despite the chaos surrounding them. As the night drew to a close, Sophie and Maxwell stood together by the window, looking out over the city. The streets were bustling with life, but inside, everything felt different. Sophie knew that the storm was coming, and it would be unlike anything they had faced before. But for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she wasn't alone, and with Maxwell by her side, she believed they could face whatever came next together. The next few days after their conversation were filled with a heavy silence that hung over Sophie and Maxwell. They both knew what was coming. Hugo had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop, and Sophie felt the weight of his ambition bearing down on her. She had inherited more than just a fortune. She had inherited a battle. Maxwell had been protective of her, trying to shield her from the machinations of Hugo, but Sophie knew that she couldn't live in the shadows of their conflict forever. The reality was that Hugo wasn't just going to back off because they'd had a conversation. He had his eyes set on controlling Robert's enterprises, and he would do anything to get it. As much as Maxwell reassured her, Sophie couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger surrounding her. She was being pulled in two directions, one toward the safety and security Maxwell offered, and the other toward the ruthless ambition of Hugo, who was willing to manipulate anyone and anything to get his hands on what he wanted. Maxwell stood in his penthouse office, looking out over the city. His hands were clenched at his sides, his thoughts focused on Sophie. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was now at risk because of Hugo's obsession with Sophie's inheritance. He had always trusted Hugo, but now, with every new move his friend made, Maxwell was starting to wonder if he had misjudged him. The anger he had been suppressing was bubbling to the surface. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew the time had come for him to make a decision. Was he going to allow Hugo to manipulate Sophie, or was he going to stand up for what was right? Maxwell's thoughts turned to Sophie, the woman he had come to care for deeply. He had promised to protect her, but as Hugo's plot thickened, that promise became harder to keep. It was time to confront Hugo not just for business, but for Sophie. He couldn't let him take her, or the empire she was rightfully inheriting. Without a fight, the meeting took place at Maxwell's office late one evening, under the bright lights of the city skyline. Sophie had decided to accompany him, and they both knew what they had to do. It was inevitable. The confrontation between Maxwell and Hugo was about to happen. When Hugo walked into the room, he was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the same confident, polished grin that Maxwell had seen many times, but now it only felt like a mask that barely concealed the underlying tension. "Hugo," Maxwell said, his voice cold but controlled. "We need to talk." Hugo's gaze flickered to Sophie, who was standing beside Maxwell, her arms crossed, her posture tense. "Ah, Sophie," Hugo said, his voice smooth. "I'm glad you could join us. I've been meaning to talk to you, too." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Hugo smirked, leaning back in his chair. "About what you're going to do with all this power, Sophie. The inheritance, the company, how are you going to manage it? I'm sure you know how complicated things can get in business." Maxwell's eyes darkened as he took a step forward. "Stop playing games, Hugo. We both know what this is really about." Hugo's smirk faded, and for the first time, Sophie saw a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "You think I'm the one playing games? Maxwell, you're the one who's been hiding the truth from Sophie. You're trying to protect her, but what about the company? What about what's best for Robert's Enterprises? She's just a pawn in this game, and I intend to make sure she knows it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat as the reality of Hugo's words sank in. "What are you saying?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" Hugo leaned forward, his voice dripping with manipulation. "What I want, Sophie, is simple. You're the heir to a legacy, and whether you like it or not, you have a responsibility. But you're not ready for it. You need someone to guide you, someone who understands how the game works. I've been in this business for years. I know what needs to be done." Maxwell stepped between them, his voice hard. "No, Hugo, you don't get to manipulate Sophie. This is her legacy, her decision. You'll have no part in it." Hugo's eyes flashed with anger. "You're making a mistake, Maxwell. You've always been too soft on her. She's in over her head, and you know it. The sooner she realizes that, the sooner we can both move forward. The company needs someone strong to lead it." Sophie felt a surge of anger, but she fought to keep her composure. "I don't need anyone telling me what I can or can't do," she said firmly. "I will decide what happens to the company, and I will decide who I trust." Maxwell's hand brushed against hers, and she looked up at him, finding a quiet strength in his touch. She knew he was trying to protect her, but now she had to protect herself. Hugo glared at them both, clearly frustrated by the lack of control he had over the situation. He stood up abruptly, straightening his suit jacket. "You'll regret this, both of you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Mark my words, you'll see that I was right." Maxwell didn't flinch. "Get out, Hugo. You've overstayed your welcome," with one last cold look. Hugo turned and left the room, the door slamming behind him. The tension in the air was palpable, but it had finally been broken. Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Turning to Maxwell, "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft. Maxwell nodded, his expression serious. "You don't need to thank me, but you need to know that you don't have to go through this alone. We'll face whatever comes together." Sophie looked up at him, her heart beating faster. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she wasn't drowning in uncertainty. Maxwell had made a promise, and he was keeping it. She wasn't alone. As Sophie and Maxwell stood in the office, the city skyline twinkling outside, a sense of relief washed over them both. They had faced down Hugo's threats, but neither of them was under any illusion this was just the beginning. Hugo wasn't going to give up that easily. But for the first time, Sophie felt confident in her ability to handle the challenges ahead. With Maxwell by her side, she knew they could navigate whatever Hugo and anyone else threw their way. Maxwell took a deep breath and turned to Sophie. "We've won this round, but we need to be ready for whatever happens next. Hugo won't stop, but neither will we." Sophie nodded. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's do this together." The air in Maxwell's office still felt thick with tension after Hugo's departure. Both Sophie and Maxwell had known that Hugo wouldn't go down without a fight, but they hadn't expected him to escalate things so quickly. The boldness in his threats left a mark on Sophie's conscience. She couldn't ignore the cold reality. Hugo wasn't just playing games anymore. He was determined to take control of everything she had. Sophie paced around the office, unable to sit still. She had never imagined that a simple inheritance would turn into a battle of wills between her, Maxwell, and Hugo. Every moment felt like she was walking on a tightrope. With no safety net beneath her, Maxwell sat at his desk, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him, but Sophie knew he was lost in thought. His usual confidence seemed shaken. He had always been in control at the helm of Thornton Group, running his empire with sharp precision. But now things were different. This wasn't about business. This was personal, and Sophie was at the center of it. Sophie, Maxwell finally spoke. His voice calm but tense. "I need to tell you something." Sophie looked up, her heart fluttering slightly. She could tell that the conversation they were about to have wasn't going to be easy. "What is it?" she asked, walking toward him and sitting down across from him. Maxwell paused, as if considering his words carefully. "I never wanted to drag you into this," he said quietly. "But Hugo's involvement has complicated everything. It's not just business anymore. It's about protecting you, protecting us." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? You're not going to give up on me, are you?" Maxwell shook his head, his expression softening. "No, that's not it. What I'm trying to say is that the stakes are higher now. Hugo isn't just after your inheritance. He's after something more, something that could destroy everything we've built together." Sophie swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you want me to do?" Maxwell reached out, taking her hand gently. "I need you to trust me. I've made mistakes. I've kept things from you. But I promise, everything I've done has been to protect you. I want to fight this, Sophie. I want to protect you, But we can't do it alone. We need to stand together, united. Sophie looked into Maxwell's eyes, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all she found was honesty. She had always admired his confidence, but now she could see the vulnerability he had been hiding behind the walls he built around himself. For the first time, Sophie understood the weight of the world he carried on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for business, he was fighting for her. "I'm with you, Maxwell," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "I don't care what Hugo does or says. I'll fight too." Later that evening, Hugo was sitting in his private office, the glow of city lights shining through the large windows. His mind was buzzing with the failure of his last confrontation with Maxwell and Sophie. He had underestimated them. He had thought that with his charm and calculated moves, Sophie would fall right into his lap. But instead, he had awakened something inside her, something stronger than he had anticipated. He reached for his phone, his fingers tapping out a message to an old associate in New York. Hugo wasn't one to give up easily. If he couldn't win through manipulation, then he'd play the long game. He had his eyes set on the Roberts Enterprises empire, and he was willing to do anything to get it. The message he sent was simple: prepare for the next phase. We take control of Roberts Enterprises, with or without Sophie's consent. Hugo knew he had to act quickly. The longer he waited, the more Maxwell and Sophie would solidify their position. He needed to sow discord, divide them, and make them doubt each other. If he could convince Sophie that Maxwell was just using her for his own gain, the foundation of their trust would crumble. The following days were filled with constant meetings and strategic decisions. Maxwell kept Sophie involved in every aspect of Roberts Enterprises, making sure she understood the gravity of the decisions that needed to be made. But with each passing day, Sophie felt more and more out of her depth. She wasn't prepared to run a multi-billion-dollar company. She wasn't prepared for the political games that came with such power. Yet, as much as she felt overwhelmed, Sophie also felt something else empowering. The more she worked alongside Maxwell, the more confident she became. She realized that she didn't have to fit the mold of a typical businesswoman. She didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. She just needed to be herself, someone with a vision, with heart and with the strength to stand up for what was right. As the days wore on, Sophie's feelings for Maxwell grew more complicated. What had started as a business relationship had slowly evolved into something much more personal. She had never expected to find herself drawn to someone like him, a man with so much power, yet so much vulnerability hidden beneath the surface. But Sophie couldn't ignore the growing tension between them. Every time Maxwell reached out to her, offering guidance and support, she felt a warmth in her chest. But at the same time, there was a fear inside her, a fear of getting too close, of letting herself fall in love with him, only to lose everything. Maxwell, too, was struggling with his feelings. His protective instincts towards Sophie had grown stronger with every passing day. He didn't want her to feel like she was in this alone, but he also knew that their relationship, whatever it was becoming more complicated. The closer they grew, the more he had to confront his own emotions. He wasn't used to feeling this way, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But as the battle with Hugo escalated, there was one thing Maxwell knew for sure: he would do anything to protect Sophie, even if it meant risking everything. The real test came sooner than either of them expected. One evening, Sophie received an anonymous message on her phone. "Maxwell is hiding something from you. He's been using you to get control of Roberts Enterprises. Don't trust him." The message was simple, yet it hit Sophie hard. She stared at the screen for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected that something was off, but this felt different. Was it possible that Maxwell was using her? Sophie didn't know who sent the message or what their intentions were, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She had to know the truth, and she couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Sophie woke up with a deep sense of unease. She had barely slept, the message from the anonymous source haunting her thoughts throughout the night. Was Maxwell truly trustworthy, or had she been used all along? Her instincts told her she needed answers, but the more she thought about it, the more conflicted she became. She cared for Maxwell, she cared for him deeply, but the doubts were starting to cloud her. Judgment. Maxwell had been nothing but supportive, guiding her through the process of managing her inheritance. But could she trust him completely, knowing how many people wanted to control her fortune? Hugo had already made it clear that he was willing to do anything to gain control of Robert's enterprises. And Sophie couldn't ignore the fact that Hugo had the resources and influence to make his threats a reality. Later that day, Maxwell called Sophie to meet at his office. There was an urgency in his voice that she couldn't ignore. When she arrived, he was standing by the window, his posture tense. He turned to face her as she entered. "Sophie, we need to talk," Maxwell said, his voice low but firm. "Things have gotten more complicated. Hugo is making his move." Sophie's stomach churned. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. "What do you mean, Maxwell?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Maxwell walked toward her, his expression serious. "I've discovered that Hugo has been using your inheritance to manipulate the board members of Robert's enterprises. He's been working behind the scenes to position himself as the one who should lead the company. If we don't act fast, he'll have control of everything before we know it." Sophie's heart pounded. The magnitude of the situation was overwhelming. "So, what do we do now?" Maxwell paused, his gaze hardening. "We fight back. We need to expose Hugo for what he's been doing. We can't let him take everything from you, Sophie." Sophie felt a surge of determination. She knew this battle wasn't just about her inheritance anymore. It was about her future, her identity, and the life she had begun to build with Maxwell. She couldn't let Hugo take that away. "I'm with you, Maxwell," she said, her voice steady. "Let's stop him." That night, Sophie received another anonymous message. This one was even more chilling than the last. "Hugo knows everything about you and Maxwell. He's planning to use you to take over the company. Don't trust him. It's all a game to him." Sophie stared at the message in disbelief. Her heart raced as she wondered who was behind these cryptic warnings. Was it someone who wanted to help her, or someone trying to manipulate her even more? She didn't know who to trust anymore. As if on cue, Hugo called her later that evening. His voice was smooth, calm, but there was a certain undertone to his words that sent a chill down Sophie's spine. "Sophie, I hope you've thought about what we discussed," Hugo said, his tone deceptively gentle. "I know this inheritance has been thrust upon you unexpectedly, but you need to make the right decision. Maxwell doesn't care about you. He only cares about controlling the company. He's using you as a pawn in a game he's been playing for years." Sophie clenched her phone, her hands trembling. "That's not true, Hugo. Maxwell is trying to help me. I'm not a pawn in anyone's game." Hugo laughed softly, the sound almost sinister. "You don't get it, do you? Maxwell is a businessman, Sophie. He'll do whatever it takes to get what he wants. And right now, what he wants is your company." You're just a means to an end. Sophie's mind raced. Was Hugo right? Was Maxwell really using her, as he had suggested? Or was this just another one of his manipulative tactics? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but deep down, she knew she couldn't trust Hugo. She wouldn't let him turn her against the one person who had truly been there for her. I won't let you manipulate me. Hugo, she said, her voice shaking with anger. And I won't let you take my inheritance either. Hugo's voice turned cold. We'll see about that. The game's just beginning, Sophie. The next morning, Sophie met with Maxwell to discuss their next move. She felt conflicted, but she also knew she had to stand her ground. They couldn't allow Hugo to take control of Robert's enterprises, and she wasn't going to back down. We need to expose Hugo's plan to the board, Maxwell said, pacing in his office. He's already gained the trust of several key members, but I've been digging into his activities. I have enough evidence to bring him down, but we need to act quickly. Sophie nodded, determined. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Maxwell turned to her, his expression serious. Sophie, you need to be prepared. Hugo won't go down without a fight. He'll try to turn people against you, make you doubt your ability to lead. But you have to trust yourself. Sophie took a deep breath. I know I trust you, Maxwell. And I trust myself. Maxwell smiled, though there was a hint of worry in his eyes. Good, because this is going to get messy. Sophie and Maxwell gathered the board members of Robert's Enterprises for an emergency meeting. As they sat around the long conference table, the tension in the room was palpable. Hugo had been absent, likely preparing for his next move. Sophie could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about her future, her independence, and her ability to control the legacy her father had left behind. Maxwell stood up to address the board, his voice calm and authoritative. We've called this meeting today to address some concerns about the direction of Robert's Enterprises. There have been certain allegations, and we need to make sure the company is being run with transparency and integrity. Sophie could feel the eyes of the board members on her as she stood up to speak. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she knew this was her moment. I'm here to make one thing clear, Sophie said, her voice steady and strong. I am the heir to Robert's Enterprises. This is my company, and I won't let anyone, Hugo or anyone else, try to take that away from me. I've worked hard to get to where I am, and I won't be manipulated by anyone. There was a moment of silence in the room as the board members exchanged glances. Then one of the senior members spoke up. Sophie, we've always respected your father's legacy, but you're new to this world. Can we trust you to lead this company? Sophie met his gaze, unflinching. I've always known what it takes to lead, and I'll prove to you that I'm more than capable of running this company, with or without anyone's approval. Maxwell stood by her side, his support unwavering. The board members were silent for a moment before nodding in agreement. Sophie had earned their trust. As the meeting adjourned, Sophie felt a sense of relief wash over her. They had won this battle. For now, Hugo was outplayed, and Sophie had claimed her rightful place as the leader of Robert's Enterprises. But the battle was far from over. Sophie knew that Hugo would strike back, and she had to be prepared. Maxwell turned to her, his expression softening. You did it, Sophie, he said quietly. You took control, and now you can lead. Sophie smiled, her heart filled with both pride and determination. We did it, Maxwell, together. But as they walked out of the conference room, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Hugo wasn't done yet. He would be back, and this time the stakes were even higher. The days following Sophie's victory over Hugo felt surreal. She had faced the most intense challenge of her life, and somehow she had come out on top. The board had stood by her, and she was now firmly in control of Robert's enterprises. The company was hers to lead, and she was determined to prove that she could do it on her own terms. But despite the sense of accomplishment, Sophie couldn't shake the weight of the battle that was yet to come. Hugo hadn't been completely defeated. Maxwell had assured her that Hugo would retreat for now, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Hugo was a master manipulator, and Sophie had no doubt that he was already plotting his next move. Yet, in this moment of victory, Maxwell had been by her side every step of the way. He had been her rock, offering support when she needed it most. And, despite everything they had been through, Sophie found herself feeling something more than gratitude for him. She had started to realize that what she felt for Maxwell went beyond business. It was something deeper, something she couldn't deny any longer. It was a quiet evening at Maxwell's penthouse when the two of them finally had a moment alone. The city lights glittered below, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of calm. Sophie and Maxwell sat on the balcony, sipping wine, the air cool and crisp as they watched the world below. "I never thought we'd be here," Maxwell said softly, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "I never imagined that I'd be standing next to someone like you, Sophie. You've done more than I could ever have hoped for. You've proven yourself as a leader." Sophie smiled, though there was a lingering tension in her heart. "I didn't do it alone. You were there for me every step of the way." Maxwell turned to her, his expression serious. "I'm not just talking about the company, Sophie. I'm talking about everything. You've become more than just a business partner to me. I care about you. I don't know how or when it happened, but I do." Sophie felt her heart race. She'd always known there was something between them, but hearing Maxwell say it out loud made it feel real too real. She had spent so long focusing on the business, on her inheritance, on the pressure of being the sole heir to a massive fortune, that she had buried her emotions. But now, with Maxwell so close, Sophie couldn't ignore what had been growing between them. "I care about you, too," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know if I can balance everything. The company, my inheritance, and us. It feels like too much to handle." Maxwell reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "Sophie, I'm not asking you to choose between me and the company. I want to be by your side, no matter what happens. But I also want you to know that you don't have to carry this burden alone. We're in this together." Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the sincerity in his words. She had been so afraid of losing herself in this world of power and wealth. But Maxwell's presence was a reminder that she didn't have to face it alone. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "We are in this together." Just as Sophie and Maxwell were starting to find their footing, Hugo made his move. It wasn't a direct attack. He knew better than to challenge Sophie openly now that she had secured her place in the company. But Hugo had his own plans, and they were just as dangerous as his previous attempts. Maxwell's team uncovered new information that suggested Hugo had been secretly rallying support from some of the board members. He was attempting to undermine Sophie's leadership by using their shared history to his advantage, subtly planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who still favored him. Maxwell immediately called Sophie to a meeting. The weight of the situation hit them both as they sat down in his office, the tension palpable. Hugo wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "We need to move quickly," Maxwell said, his voice grave. "Hugo is playing a long game. He's already trying to destabilize the board again, and if we don't act now, he'll find a way to turn them against you." Sophie's heart raced, but she took a deep breath. "Then we fight back. We expose him for what he is. We won't let him destroy everything." Maxwell nodded, the resolve in his eyes matching hers. "We'll have to play this smart. We need to outmaneuver him, use his own tactics against him. I'll handle the board, but you'll need to be ready to step up when the time comes." Sophie stood up, her shoulders squared. She wasn't going to let Hugo tear apart the life she had worked so hard to build, not her company, and not her relationship with Maxwell. This was her fight now, in the following days. Maxwell and Sophie worked tirelessly to rally support from the remaining board members. It wasn't easy, as many were swayed by Hugo's charm and manipulative tactics. But Sophie's authenticity and unwavering determination started to turn the tide. Slowly, she regained control, proving that her strength as a leader came not from her inheritance, but from her will to fight for what was right. The final showdown came in a tense board meeting, where Hugo attempted one last push for control. Sophie stood up, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the room. "Hugo," she said, locking eyes with him, "you've played your games. But now, it's time for you to leave. You've tried to manipulate me, my company, and my family, but I won't let you succeed. Roberts Enterprises is mine to lead, and it's time we moved forward without you." For a moment, Hugo said nothing. The room was silent, every person waiting for him to react. But in the end, Hugo only smiled a cold, calculating smile. "You may have won this round, Sophie," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But this isn't over. You'll see." With that, Hugo turned and walked out of the room, his defeat final. Sophie had won. She had not only claimed her rightful place as the leader of Roberts Enterprises, but she had also proven to herself, and to everyone, that she was more than capable of handling the challenges ahead. After the meeting, Sophie felt a sense of relief wash over her. The battle with Hugo was over, but there was still much to do. She had to rebuild, reorganize, and prove to the world and to herself that she could lead Roberts Enterprises into the future. Maxwell stood by her side, just as he always had. Their relationship had deepened throughout the ordeal, and now, more than ever, Sophie knew that their bond was unbreakable. "Sophie," Maxwell said, his voice tender as he took her hand in his. "You did it. You took control of everything, your inheritance, your life. I'm so proud of you." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "I couldn't have done it without you, Maxwell. We did this together." Maxwell leaned in, his gaze softening. Together, forever. Sophie's heart fluttered as they stood there, hand in hand, looking out over the city they both had fought so hard for. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were ready for it, together.